As we dive deeper into the material here in Chapter 6, one of the things I kind of want to point out as we start to work through this is that a lot of this early research on the economics of government was actually done, I guess, fairly recently. It really starts in the 1960s, and it was originally called public choice. That is, how do people in government make choices? That's why it's called public choice. Okay? And so as we kind of go through this, that's kind of the background. That's where this comes. So what we're going to do is talk about public choice and then talk about the different actors in government, right? In chapters 3 and 4, when we talked about supply and demand, we said, okay, who are the groups of people we're interested in? Well, buyers make up demand, sellers make up supply, right? And so we're going to do the same thing here as we think about government. What are the different groups in governments, different groups that act in government, and what are the incentives that they face? Okay. So public choice is nothing more than using basic economic principles, right? The stuff that we've developed in chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, to study the operation and decisions made in government, right? Economics is the study of people making choices when they have to deal with scarcity. Whether those choices are in the market or in government, doesn't matter. They're choices, and we can study them, right? So public choice is where our focus is on government decision making, okay? So let's spend some time talking about the different groups in government, okay? And we're going to focus on 3. First, we're going to talk about voters. That's most of us, right? Then we're going to talk about politicians. And lastly, we're going to talk about bureaucrats, okay? So first up are the voters, right? So that's us. Well, again, I can kind of joke about this, but, in a good year, maybe 58% of us vote, right? When it comes to voting, right, a lot of times there's not 100% voter turnout. We don't have mandatory voting, or what is sometimes called compulsory voting here in the United States. So, okay, we're voters. Clearly, we're self-interested. We talked about our self-interest when we do things in the marketplace, right? But one of the things I want to touch on is how educated are we as voters, okay? Well, some of you might be thinking, yeah, I'm a really good educated voter. I would beg to differ. So let's kind of go through and think about how knowledgeable we are when it comes to politics, right? So how many of you, off the top of your head, know who the current president of the United States is? Right? Well, most of you are probably raising your hand. You don't have to raise your hands. It's video, but hopefully you said it's Joe Biden, right? Okay, fine. How many of you can name who the current vice president of the United States is? Right? Well, there's probably fewer of you that know that. Be Kamala Harris, okay? All right, next question. How many of you know who the next most powerful person is in government? Right? Probably even fewer of you know this, right? This would be the Speaker of the House of Representatives, right? In terms of succession, in terms of presidency, third in line is the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Now, the Speaker of the House is the leader of the majority party in the House of Representatives, right? That is currently Nancy Pelosi, right? So I'm sure fewer of you knew that. What about the Senate, right? Well, the Senate has a majority leader, right? And right now, it is Charles Schumer of New York. So again, as I'm going through these are just basic aspects of politics, and there's probably most of you who weren't really sure who these people were or are, right? How many of you know who your senators are from your home state? Both of them, right? Each state has 2. Did you know that each state has 2? Okay, how many of you know who your representative is in the House of Representatives? Right? How many of you can name who that is? Right? How many of you know who your state representative is? That is, who represents your district or the district where you're from in the state legislature, right? Whether it's here in Florida or somewhere else, right? Probably very few of you know who these people are, right? So, but now just to kind of have some fun here, how many of you know and can tell me the last person Pete Davidson dated, right? Now, I bet you a ton of you know the answer to that one, right? I think he just broke up with Kardashian something, Kim Kardashian, right? I'm an economics professor. What do I know about this stuff? But I bet you most of you know that, right? You know more about the love life of Pete Davidson and Kim Kardashian than you do about the basic structure of American government, right? So as voters, we're not the most educated voters, right? And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about, okay? But we're not doing this to kind of bash people and bash ourselves and bash voters. We're going to point out the basics of this, which is that a lot of times there's not a strong incentive for us to be a well-informed voter, right? So let's think about gathering information. In a market, right, there's generally a pretty strong incentive to gather information before a choice, right? It's a pretty strong incentive to gather information before a purchase. And you might ask, why is this the case, right? Well, because let's suppose we're thinking about buying a used car, right? If I make a lousy choice in buying a used car, if I buy a car that's a piece of junk, right? I have to deal with the problems. I have to deal with taking the car to the mechanic and paying all these bills and the headache and getting the car breaking down on the interstate and being stranded and having to get towed, right? All these costs will fall on me if I make a poor choice, right? And so this is why before buying a car or a computer or all these other things or renting a house, we do a lot of research, right? If it's a car, we look up the Carfax, we take the car to a mechanic to have it evaluated. There's all kinds of different review sites. We can look at dealerships and whether they're good or not, or shysters and stuff like that. We do a lot of research, right? And again, it's primarily because we have a strong incentive to do that research, because if we make a poor choice, we have to deal with the cost, right? However, in politics, there is a weaker incentive to gather information. Weaker incentive to gather information. Right? Because what happens to me personally if I make a poor choice when I vote? I don't know. I mean, probably not much is going to change when it comes to my tax rates. I mean, even here in Florida, we don't even have state income taxes, right? Is much going to happen to my salary, my pay, my retirement benefits? Is anything going to happen to my, wife and daughter? No. I mean, whether we elect one politician or another, the meaningful impact on my life is probably small, right? So whether I'm an informed voter or an uninformed voter, there's probably not going to be many consequences that come my way depending on how I vote for a politician or for a proposition or something like that, right? So there's a weaker incentive to gather information in politics because not much of what I vote for will affect my day-to-day life. Not much of what I vote for will affect day-to-day life. Now, you might argue, hey, look, there are consequences down the road. Possibly, right? But a lot of times those consequences are way down the road, right? If we think about government debt that we're at some point going to have to deal with, we've been worried about that for decades, and we still haven't dealt with it, right? That's still coming decades down the road, right? So a lot of times these consequences of maybe poor political choices come way, way in the future. They're not immediate, okay? Okay, so we have a name or kind of an idea for this. We call it the rational ignorance of the voter. So, because we have a weak incentive to gather information before we vote, we generally aren't terribly knowledgeable about politics, political process, political issues. This is why many of us in most election years don't vote, right? We're disinterested, right? We don't even know who's running, right? In upcoming elections, how do I know what judge to reaffirm and to reappoint? I don't know anything about the judges, right? So many of these issues have little effect on our day-to-day life, right? And our ability as a voter to have a decisive impact on an election is tiny, right? Especially in a large state like Florida, right? Now, I know all your teachers and everybody's told you that your vote counts and yada, 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 and voting's great and stuff like that. But look, your vote really doesn't count, right? The impact is tiny. When millions of people vote, the impact of your one vote is small. And this is something that's understood in politics, right? This is why politics, as they think about voting in different groups, they think about groups, blocks, right? The older voters, younger voters, different demographic groups, right? They're thinking about groups, not individual voters, but groups. That's who they're trying to sway when it comes to politics. The impact of a single vote is tiny, right? Okay, so that basically kind of sums up what we're talking about here with voters, right? We're going to have different things we're interested in, different priorities when we go to vote, right? We're probably going to be knowledgeable about those few things, but most other things we're generally not going to be as knowledgeable about, right? And so we call this rational ignorance of the voter. It's very rational for us to not really keep up with a lot of things in politics because, again, it doesn't affect our day-to-day life, okay? So now let's move on and talk about politicians. Now, clearly, like voters, they're self-interested, right? So they're interested in getting your vote to remain in office, right? It could be for noble reasons. Maybe there's some politicians you like, right? And we hope they're noble people, right? But could also be for selfish reasons, right? People in politics, it's a good salary, right? If you in the federal House or in the Senate, right? Retirement benefits are great. Great health care benefits. You get to hang out in D.C. You get a travel budget. So there's also prestige, right? There's all kinds of different reasons, both selfish and noble, that people would want to get into office, right? So we can't assume when we talk about, hey, let's have politicians in government maybe solve some of these problems. We can't assume they're going to solve these problems, right? They have their own self-interest, their own things they're interested in, their own issues they're more passionate about, and other issues less so, right? So we know politicians are just as self-interested and just as selfish as we are, right? They're not angels, right? They're just like us, okay? So one of the thing or an example that helps us or that provides kind of a funny way of thinking about the self-interest of politicians, right? If politicians were honest, good people, we wouldn't see this. And you might be asking, okay, what is this? This is what we call gerrymandering. Gerrymandering. This is a very U.S.-based term, but it is the manipulation let's see, was I going to put it on the next slide? No, that's bureaucrats. Manipulation of voting districts manipulation of voting districts to favor an incumbent or a party. Okay. So it turns out our voting districts in Florida have just recently changed. But up until a little bit ago, these were voting districts. And let me point out to you the 5th Congressional District. Okay. It starts here in a little sliver of Orlando and goes up here, over here, around here, up here, over here, grabs this little piece, which is just half of a tiny little lake, goes up here, grabs this west side of a lake, goes up here, around here, over here, down over here, up around here. I have no idea what they're including here. Grabs this little part of some town that I can't even see the name of, up along this river, all the way to this tiny little sliver here, just so that it can capture this whole part of Jacksonville. And then it comes back down this little sliver all the way over here so they can go over here and capture half of Gainesville, not all of Gainesville, just half of Gainesville. And then comes back down here, over here, loops over here. Yeah, this was totally not to favor somebody. Down over here, down over here, looping around. Grabs this half of a lake, down over here, and back down over there. That is a voting district, and that is called gerrymandering, right? It's politicians manipulating voting districts so they can partition the electorate to favor a party, favor themselves, what have you, right? So, again, clearly politicians are going to be self-interested, right? They're not going to be these angels and saints who call themselves public servants. There's things they're interested in, and they're going to be susceptible to pressure, to lobbying, to campaign contributions, all these things, right? So that'll help us understand the different incentives facing politicians in government. All right, our last group is what we call bureaucrats, okay? So bureaucrats are non-elected people that work in the agencies of government, okay? All right, so these are people who work in, right, the CDC, the Food and Drug Administration, that's the FDA, work in the Fed, right, work for the Postal Service. And there's also, right, state bureaucracies, right, the Florida Treasury, right? There's a bunch of different examples, right? They're not elected, right? These are jobs where they're either appointed or they, were selected for the job, right? A lot of these people would work inside, say, a president's administration or an administrative office, right? So they're not elected, but they work and staff all the agencies of government, okay? Now, bureaucrats, like voters and politicians, are going to be self-interested, right? Now, it might be for noble reasons, right? Maybe someone gets into a particular branch of government because they're passionate about it, right? Maybe it's environmental stuff. Maybe it's, defense issues. Maybe it's, poverty and social issues, stuff like that. Anti-drug campaigns. I don't know. There's all kinds of different things. It could be for noble reasons, right? But one of the things we know is that bureaucrats like to increase the power and influence and prestige of their bureau. Now, it could be for noble reasons, but it also could be for self-interested ones. They might like the power, right? People who are in charge of big agencies in Washington, D.C. are a big deal in Washington, D.C., right? During the COVID pandemic, right? Probably the most famous bureaucrat that you saw all the time was Anthony Fauci, right? He would have been a big-time bureaucrat in D.C., right? So there's power, there's influence, right? If you're in charge of a big bureau in D.C., you've got influence, prestige, your salary is quite high, right in the news, they pointed out that Anthony Fauci was the highest paid person in all of government, right? So there's a lot of self-interested reasons why someone in a bureau would want that agency to be bigger budgets, right? And so as we talk about, well, how do we curb spending? A lot of times agencies and bureaucracies don't want to curb spending, right? They want larger budgets, right? Larger budgets means more power and influence. And again, it could be something they're passionate about, right? But it does mean they're always going to want more money for their agency, right? You've got all these agencies in DC that are all vying for more and more and more money. And so it's not a surprise that our budget each year gets bigger and bigger and bigger, okay? Okay, so those are our three groups. Each one's going to have different things they're self-interested in. There's voters, and voters, even though there's topics they might be interested in, for the most part, voters a lot of times aren't well informed, and a lot of times voters don't even vote, right? For politicians, they need votes to stay in office, and they might have noble reasons to stay in office or very selfish, self-interested reasons, right? Bureaucrats want to increase the size of the bureau. Could be because it's something they're passionate about, or maybe they're just power-hungry jerks, right? All these people are operating in government, and we can understand a little better the incentives that each group faces.